Hello, I'm Stephen Matchett, and I'm still standing after the biggest week for education policy since Cardinal Newman jotted down a few ideas in 1852. And that's because it's the release this week of Mary O'Kane and colleagues' Universities Accord. I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation this morning, and I offer my respects to them and to all Indigenous Australians with us this morning. If, and it is still an if the government funds the Accord, it will take decades to implement, not least because it will take that long to read. But after a few days, the big visions for Australian tertiary education appear to be clear. More university places, especially for people from low SES quintiles, an end to the divide between training and higher education, a tertiary education commission, and not entirely clear in detail commitment to research funding. Plus, the Accord includes expansive changes for learning, teaching and research, variously backed by recommendations for more targeted but not specified amounts of money. I'm joined today by four people across the Accord to talk about all the areas they think are especially important. And my colleague Tim Winkler is here to put questions from the floor to them throughout the discussion. Producer Amanda Johnson is also thankfully present, and without her, I'd be even more disconnected than usual. First up, let me welcome our panellists. Kylie Austin is the President of Equity Practitioners in Higher Education Australasia. Education Minister Jason Clare is long on the record about the need for many more students from low SES backgrounds, starting and more importantly, finishing university. Dr. Austin's members are the people who will make that happen. Professor Chennupati Jagadish is a physicist at ANU, but he is here as President of the Australian Academy of Science. Last month, he called for a national strategy of research to boost investment in R&D, which would fix Australia's, and I quote, incoherent system, which is band-aided to slow the bleeding, but not to fix the problem. Megan Lilly is Executive Director of Education and Training at Australian Industry Group and a long-time advocate for a nimble and flexible training system which meets student and employer needs. She was a member of the Noonan Review of the Australian Qualification Framework and is one of a handful of people who both understand the AQF and can actually explain it. Dr Terri MacDonald is Director of Public Policy and Strategic Research for the National Tertiary Education Union. The NTEU's initial position appears to be qualified support for the Accord, that it has, and I quote again, the potential to create better universities, but only if it is implemented correctly and funded properly. I am interested to hear both. And Luke Sheehy is with us. Mr. Sheehy is the bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, very new CEO of Universities Australia. He's just moved into that job from the Australian Technology Network, which he transformed into a policy powerhouse over the years. Thank you all for being here. I know you're busy. I know it's been a very big week, but thank you for sparing the time to join us this morning. Questions through the chat. Tim Winkler will pass them on. So let me start with you, Mr. Sheehy, sir. Can I ask what the Accord's going to mean for your members, like now and over the next year or so, as the government's vision becomes clear and first steps are made?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen, and thanks for inviting me onto this panel. I am only in my fourth week, so it does feel like it's the time to be alive for higher ed, tertiary ed policy nerds. So probably in the right place at the right time, and it's a very exciting report, and it's come a long way, if I might say, from the original discussion paper to the interim report, which to a kind of very bold and very substantial roadmap for reform of both higher education, but the broader tertiary education piece. And I've been quite passionate about that for a long time. What your question's really about, what's it mean for members? I think the first focus, there's obviously a kind of bureaucratic establishment of the Tertiary Education Commission to design a needs-based funding model, to look at the recommendations around how to reform the research funding, understand mission-based volume and block, and what components are demand-driven. So there's a lot of technical bureaucratic stuff that has to happen. But I think in the first instance, where I think everyone's in vociferous agreement, which happens all the time, as you can imagine, across 39 public universities, is the focus on students, right? There are things that can be done by the government and that we will all, of course, welcome, making the payment arrangements with the higher education loan program fairer and more fit for purpose, ensuring there are more places for students, particularly with the proposal to uncap enabling places, or I think they're calling them fee-free university preparatory courses. There are things we can do to address the arrangements for student income support. Placement poverty is an issue that many student groups and many universities have talked about for a long time now, and seeking to help students go and do the placements they need to get the qualifications to become teachers or clinicians. That's really important, and we're going to encourage the government to act on that as quickly as they can. Of course, the government has an election year budget coming up in May, and it's got its own electoral priorities, so they'll have to balance those, of course. But I think a focus initially on students is really important, and I think a unifying response from our sector.
Cynics would suggest, but I mean, what can you expect from cynics? But cynics would suggest that the tertiary education, as set out in the Accord, comes straight out of the Leonid Brezhnev playbook. I mean, it's going to be immensely comprehensive and immensely powerful if they get everything. I wonder how it's all going to fit together, but maybe we come back to that more generally. Kylie Austin, how is what's there about equity and an expanded system? What's the challenge there for your members?
Yeah, I think, look, with the interim report that was released back in August, there were those five priority actions that have taken place. And so I think we're already feeling as equity practitioners in the sector, the outputs of some of the Accord already, because we're having to implement, the outcomes of the support for students policy. There's already talk about, we're already engaging regarding, the regional study hubs and the CSP places for First Nations people as well. I think, there's a lot in the Accord that we're really, really pleased to see and that we're really excited about, including the demand-driven places for equity students, population parity, and also, as Luke said, really putting students at the heart and addressing things like placement poverty and income support and things like that as well. However, there's also a lot of aspects, I think, in the Accord report that, are very high level. And so I think we've got a lot of advocacy to do over the coming months and years around how some of these pieces are shaped, particularly around the needs-based funding for equity students and how that plays out at an institutional level for institutions. As well as, things like the reshaping of widening participation and outreach. I think our members across the sector will have a view on what that looks like, and there's a lot of expertise across the sector there, and I think we would be really, really keen to work collaboratively with the government and potentially the Australian Tertiary Commission to help shape what some of those things will look like.
Okay. Professor, strikes me that there is less detail for research in the report, in the Accord, than for other fields. Do you have a sense that they have grasped your issues?
Stephen, yes. And I think with respect to the interim report, the final report has at least addressed the importance of research in the university's Accord, and then the importance of the need for creation of new knowledge, skills, innovation, and research, and make use of that one to be able to enhance Australia's productivity and standard of living and innovation. So from that point of view, I think at least they've addressed the importance of research for the sector and the need for the nation, continued creation of knowledge and making use of that knowledge to make sure that our country continues to flourish and we can maintain high standard of living for people in our country.
The Academy has previously talked about the need for an inquiry specifically on research broadly defined. Do you still feel the need for that?
Absolutely. In fact, the report itself, Stephen, talks about that. The need for cross-portfolio examination of the research investment which we are making to identify the gaps and then overlaps, and then also develop a plan for a decade plan of the R&D investments for the future of the country to make sure that we can bring the research system to the 21st century, fit for 21st century.
Terri MacDonald, the Accord has the potential to create better universities, but if it's implemented correctly and funded properly. How will implementing it correctly take shape?
Well, there has to be a great deal of consultation with the sector, with university staff and with students and with other organisations and groups, in how we mould this new, this blueprint for the sector. So, I mean, the Universities Accord is a very good and important step, but it's just a step forward. We actually need to see what government is going to adopt and how's it going to be funded. The core to this will be the Tertiary Education Commission, so we do need to get that right. And then, of course, the funding underpins everything. It underpins reforms through research, it underpins student equity, it underpins workforce improvements. So we need to make sure that the funding model is fair, equitable, transparent, and hopefully depoliticised to the extent that, we can actually be assured that the funding that universities are getting is stable and that it meets the needs. So those are the things that we're going to be looking for as we move forward. But we definitely do want to hear what the government plans to do now that it has this blueprint.
So depoliticised, is it important for the Commission to be up and running in some form or another so that it is driving consultation rather than the department?
So I actually think that there'll be a little bit of both happening as we move forward. So we're going to have the consultation over, what in the report's going to be, adopted. If we are going to have a tertiary education commission, which I suspect we probably will, then what form does that take? And of course, there's going to be the implementation committee or the implementation group, which is going to be, involved in that. So it's going to take a little while for these things to be put in place. But I think, and we've worked with the department on a number of things, but at the end of the day, what you want is a structural system which, the rules are clear, the reporting's transparent on, and the funding is fair. And that's essentially what we would be looking for with the new commission.
I want to come to Megan Lee, but just very quickly first, to anybody who wants to answer, the commission, the commission's membership at an executive level, should it represent players in players is such a loaded word. Should it represent participants in the system, or should it be a committee of experts?
I can have a crack at that first and then pass over. So our view is that while you have commissioners, and they are essentially going to be, supported by, commission staff who will be, experts as well. We think that there needs to be the consultative committee or the reference group that's advising the commission definitely does need representation from the sector, 100%. Staff, students, unions, business, who have interest, in the research areas and things like that too. So there has to be buy-in from the sector. So we actually would be pushing that line very strongly.
Luke Sheehy, what do you think about that?
Yeah, look, I agree. I think one of the things that we also, and we've had some really fantastic tripartite approaches to consultation on this, which is, absolutely warmly and strongly welcomed. But the thing that I think is important is that we have expertise on governance and how to set up a bureaucracy to make sure that the actual structures are put in place. I know it's a very boring comment to make, but to make sure that you've got a proper sense of how's it going to work, how's it going to report to two ministers, how's it going to have potentially other pre-legislated agencies come into it, and the relationship between those commissioners. So there is a bit of, it's a recovering lawyer in me to think about how all of those legal component parts and administrative law and cabinet and all of those things work. So should be a absolute focus on, students, voices from the workers of our sector and through the union movement, and the universities and vocational education providers and business. But again, understanding how to nail the right organisational structure for an agency of the Commonwealth is important too.
Well, I mean, the provisions already, recommendations that TEXA and the ARC, if become part of the commission writ large, if not actually subordinated to it. But then, of course, it's going to have to get on with Jobs and Skills Australia, and I dare say state ministers are all going to have a view as well. Sounds to me like it could end up like the great pie fight from Jack Lemmon's film The Great Race. But what do I know? Megan, Lilly, it seems to me that this is really, really good for your members and certainly for AIG. It seems to me that what this is potentially is the biggest attempt to try and transform post-school education on a cooperative basis since the competency-based training debate of the early 90s, which didn't really go anywhere. But it does seem immensely positive for a lot of the things that you've argued for a long time. Is that a fair?
Yeah, we're pretty happy, and I mean the report. I mean, it's, as you already noted, it's a really big, comprehensive document, and it's quite bold in a number of areas. But it's also comprehensive. I mean, it's not a here and now document. It's really a roadmap for the future. But it sort of positions it with the stakeholders embraced in the conversation going forward, and in the structures and the like. So from an industry point of view, it's really good that industry is absolutely central to a lot of the conversations. You know, the report puts students at the centre, and rightly so, but that needs to sort of be done in conjunction with industry so that we actually get, you know, all of these really important things sorted out. I mean, the report, I mean, the higher education, the tertiary sector, I'll choose to say, is fundamentally important for the future of this country in so many different ways, whether you talk about individuals or productivity or all these sorts of things. And so having a comprehensive but connected sort of roadmap with industry as a critical player in that, I think, is a really important step forward, and actually laying down some structural markers around how we build a tertiary sector rather than have this sort of really unhelpful divide between vocational and higher education that might suit institutions, but it absolutely doesn't suit students or industry. And I think we sort of need to remind ourselves of some of those important things. But I mean, the last thing, of course, I'm going to put in a plug for the Australian Qualifications Framework, and I was on that panel, as you've already noted, and that to me is, you know, been embraced in the report, and I see that as the central policy architecture to create the system we need going forward. So I would put that first pick, get on with it, and structure the thing properly and embrace the future in the process.
Professor Jagadish, on that, some of your members might be a little conservative in terms of their attitudes towards working across sectors. I mean, some of your members are researching in very, very specialist and very, very high level areas. Is there going to be resistance from the research community to the idea of a broader and unified post-secondary system?
No, not at all. In fact, that's a healthy thing, Stephen, that it's important to, of course, the report also emphasizes the importance of investing in fundamental research and applied research, and also translation of that one to be able to produce benefit to the government and industry, for example. Again, the report says the more need for the utilization of the university research, first and foremost, we need to produce university research and then make use of that one by the government as well as industry. It is very important. And because if we produce research and if nobody is using it, it's not going to benefit our nation in terms of productivity point of view and innovation point of view. And also we've been finding that, you know, the skills are needed. For example, you know, if you're really starting a company, you're not going, you hire some PhDs, but also you wanted to have technical staff, for example, those who have been trained by TAFEs and, you know, the vocational sector, because they are the ones, those are able to take care of the equipment and taking care of various things. So that's why you need to have the combination of skills if you want to really build the high-tech industries in this country. So that's why Academy always encourages a full spectrum of skills from the schools to the university sector.
Luke Sheehy, degree issuing TAFEs?
Well, it's an interesting idea, isn't it, Stephen? So I think we've obviously had collaboration across universities and TAFEs on degree and other programs in the past. This isn't new. You know, I think about the excellent work that La Trobe has done in the past with the local TAFE in Bendigo for regional Victoria. You know, and I've come, as many know, from working in dual sector universities, both as RMIT as part of the ATN, but having worked at Swinburne before that. So collaboration across the system, as I said earlier, is one of my passion areas to get right in Australia. Megan's absolutely right on the AQF. And, you know, public TAFE in Australia hasn't had a great couple of decades, and it would be good to give it some certainty and stability, both in terms of its place in the tertiary system, but, you know, a more creative approach to its regulatory status as well. And I know that the TAFE Directors Australia have talked about that a lot, and I can see some of those recommendations in the Accord. I think what we want to achieve in this process over the next couple of years is to ensure that we've got strong public institutions at the backbone of the system, and complemented by high quality private provision, collaborating with industry. But to Megan's point, a student focus, and that's what's in this Accord report. The other thing I think as well is that this idea that we'll have new types of institutions as we grow. I mean, big reforms like Dawkins created new types of universities in Australia, and ministers talked about this a lot. If we're going to double the number of higher education students and then have an 80% post-secondary or tertiary attainment, we're going to need a lot more institutions, I think. So let's think about how we can build new and interesting and diverse ones to serve students and industry needs.
Terri MacDonald, to an extent, this all rather sounds, or the Accord rather sounds, making higher education becomes an arm of industry policy. It's about social mobility. It's about growing the economy. Maybe I missed the section, but I didn't see a whole lot about truth and beauty and learning for its own sake. How are some of your members of the humanities potentially going to respond to all this?
I actually think the response has been quite positive, particularly in the recommendations around the Jobs Ready Graduate package changes, because that's been a real core problem for many of our members working in the humanities. So I actually think that there's much in there. Look, there's certainly a skills focus, which is what we would expect with the jobs and skills agenda of the government, and that's fine. It's a Labor government. It's close to their heart. We didn't see anything about academic freedom in there, but that's okay. We do have some provisions around that, and universities, of course, under the governance issues, that would be a consideration. What we did find was quite helpful was the discussion around research, and that there is a scholarship component for teaching that does involve research and being informed by research. And that's something that's very important to our members, that what we, for want of a better word, would call a nexus. So we actually think that there is something in there that talks about what universities and should be doing in terms of public good, and we think that that's something that our members will certainly be watching for as we move forward, and it's one of the reasons that we certainly want to be involved in this process.
Megan, Lilly, how is this all going to be put together in a policy sense? I mean, the Commission will undoubtedly create a life of its own, and over time have its own objectives and its own policies. How are ministers going to be able to keep it on a particular path?
I'm not sure my crystal ball's quite that good, but I actually think that is a really good and important question, and I don't have an answer for it, but I do think the Commission has a policy remit as well, and reporting to two ministers is going to be a very significant challenge. Having said that, the dominant reporting will be through to the Education Minister as opposed to the Skills Minister. That's sort of been noted, but that might readjust over time. But the policy remit is one of the dot points in the recommendations around the Tertiary Education Commission. But there's also another dot point about, so there's three sort of reporting functions. One's the Education Minister, one's the Skills Minister, and the one, the sector as a whole. And so the sector as a whole is where you got to sort of try and bring it together. But the other point I'd make, that we haven't really, I don't see discussed as much actually at the moment, but the Tertiary Education Commission is sort of fundamentally focusing on the supply side, and Jobs and Skills Australia is fundamentally positioned to focus on the demand side. And I think the relationship between those two organisations is going to be really important, and really important to get that tension and information and challenge each other and all those sorts of things, and help shape policy. But I do think that there's some really significant policy architecture that needs to come early. Otherwise, we'll just be doing more of what we've already got.
Stephen, if I could just jump in there, there's some questions coming through, so I just thought we should start getting them rolled through. Kylie, I think this one might be for you. Do we think there is a risk that we encourage students into uni who then don't complete? It says attrition rates for low SES regional students are very low. I think that might mean completion rates for low SES students.
Yeah, look, I think you know, the data supports actually what the students from low socioeconomic areas, students with disability, First Nations, regional and rural and remote necessarily don't. It's not that they don't complete; they may take longer to complete. But in addition to that, I think it's really important to look at the other national data sets around student equity, which actually demonstrate, you know, sometimes higher WAMs or success rates as well. So what that really points to from our perspective is that it's not necessarily a capability issue. It is about institutional barriers to completion in higher education, which I think, and the Accord really calls that out. You know what I mean? It's things like you know, financial barriers to education, access to accommodation, having to move away from home. There's a whole range of factors here that are really institutional and system level barriers that are preventing kind of not just access to higher education, but that ongoing participation. So I think the suggestions in the Accord, you know, I think as a sector, we need to look at you know, how we address those institutional barriers in order to enable, you know, all students from both an economic driver, but also a social driver, to be able to participate in higher education. And so, you know, there's some really good examples in the Accord, but also across in terms of, and also best practice across the sector. So things like regional campuses and regional study hubs are really, really effective. There's some national research that students who study, you know, at regional campuses actually attain higher, you know, higher WAMs and success rates. And there's also a lot of evidence to demonstrate that equity scholarships, scholarships for equity students as well, can go a long way in increasing student retention. So I think it's about addressing, not problematizing the student. I think it's about, this is about addressing the barriers that our system creates for students from equity backgrounds.
Tim, may I just jump in and ask Kylie, but what about qualification mix? There are a whole bunch of people now in the TAFE sector who an undergraduate qualification mix may not suit. Isn't this going to become an equity issue to try and vary the structure of the courses?
Yeah, look, I think you do see like students from equity backgrounds, they are concentrated in things like certificate 3s and certificate 4s. So the data supports that. You know, if we're going to meet the parity targets around the Accord, I think we have to look at universities need to work more closely with TAFEs and see TAFE not as a competitor, but actually a genuine pathway into building that knowledge, those skills, in order to successfully participate in higher education.
Tim, have you got anything?
Yes, well, and more questions for the panel. I'll just keep on going because there's a diversity of issues coming through. The Indigenous voice to higher education is an exciting recommendation. Thoughts on how to make this work? It's open to all of you. Any thoughts? Anyone with inspiration there?
I might have a go at that. I think I worked for Chris Evans when Larissa Barrett handed down the Barrett review after the Bradley implementation. And I think this is really important that this comes out of it. I know that we've been talking to our First Nations colleagues here at the Universities Australia Summit this week here in Canberra. This is a, you know, fundamental, you know, how do we get both the idea of engagement with First Nations throughout the activities of the tertiary education sector, and, you know, work with them to ensure that they're better enshrined. And also, what does it mean in terms of, you know, participation in a whole range of things? So it's a really good recommendation. I know it's been strongly supported, and I hope they get up and moving on it quite quickly. I mean, the other thing to think about in terms of the TEC, there's also within the Accord, we're going to establish a TEC. We're going to have a First Nations review. We're also going to have a review of all of research and development. So I think the risk is if we wait too long. And I'd like to see it personally, and I obviously will talk to more with my colleagues around the universities to see how they want it to land, but make sure the right people are involved in the design of the terms of reference, etc., and make sure that it's working collaboratively and in concert with the establishment of the TEC and other funding redesign. I wouldn't want to see it pushed out too far, because I think it's really important that we move on it.
Jim, also our country needs the skills and of all the people in order to be able to contribute to a knowledge-based economy, because of the fact that the nations which are going to be successful are going to be faced. There will be huge amounts of demand for people, those got the right skills and abilities. So that's why we need to make use of all people in our country, and particularly targeting Aboriginal and the Torres Strait Islander people is important, because there are some disadvantages, and how to remove the disadvantages so that they feel part of our system, and then make sure that they have been given the opportunity to be able to be successful so that they can contribute to our society and economy in the best possible way.
If I can add to that, from the union point of view, the Accord, of course, is mostly focused on equity and student outcomes. We do welcome the student parity target, coming up to, I think, 3.3% from the current levels of around 2%. What we do have some qualifications around the fact that staffing workforce issues have been relegated to a proposed First Nations review. So that's something, of course, that we will continue to engage on. And establishing the First Nations Council to advise government, again, is not new, but we would be, pleased to work with government on that. We've welcomed the idea of having one of the commissioners in ATEC, focused as a First Nations commissioner. Importantly, we particularly welcome the proposal for a national racism survey, because we've actually undertaken those surveys ourselves. We've done a couple of those and found some really disturbing results from those surveys. So we think together those are a good step forward in driving better employment and education outcomes for First Nations or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff and students. We do notice the change in nomenclature too to First Nations, so that's an interesting change. But overall, we're fairly happy with the direction that is heading with this. We don't think we're there yet, but we're again heading in a good direction.
Tim?
Thank you. Yes, there's some more questions coming through again about the TEC. Is there a real politic naivety about the complexity of setting up the TEC as contemplated, particularly if it needs to be established as part of the first step? So the complexities of, you've already talked as a panel about reporting to 2 ministers, folding in 3 existing agencies. What are the challenges there in terms of staging that and the realities of it?
I'm happy to make a quick comment. I think setting it up, the TEC will be complex. Statutory authorities are not things you just stand up overnight. They need to be well thought through and legislated and funded and all those sorts of things, and then capability needs to be built within it. So I don't, if there's naivety, I think we should make sure we're not too naive about it, because and if it's important to do, which I believe it is, then it's important to do right rather than quickly. But I don't see that all of the reforms or recommendations contained within the Accord need to wait for the TEC to be established. Some of them can proceed, frankly, today. So I think really one of the critical issues is going to be sort of getting more sort of detail in the roadmap forward. So whether it's phased or staged or whatever language you want to use, but, looking at how you can sort of roll it out progressively without having to wait for, this magical entity.
And I might add as well, I think that as it's proposed, it goes over to, it's almost 2 pages of a recommendation within the report itself. So, and there was a bit of discussion around this with the Ministerial Reference Group in the development of the Accord. I think it's important that they're not so heroic about it having everything all on day one, that it does, it's almost impossible to get it started within the next 3 years. Absolutely, Megan's right. We can move on things, or the government can move on things really quickly, and they, it's likely they will. And the establishment of the commission, need not be so heroic that it can't do anything from day one. But I'm really interested, and it's probably just speaks to my general tertiary policy nerdiness, that I want some young, really clever people coming through who are experts in tertiary education policy as practitioners, as people that can move in and out of the sector of the commission into other parts of the bureaucracy. This is no criticism of the current Department of Education, but I've had the privilege of working with, the late great Peter Noonan and others that worked at ANTA in the day, and there was that created a generation of exceptional tertiary education policy experts and practitioners. So I'm hopeful that we can do that as well. So it's really important that we're encouraging young people to think about tertiary policy as a career, and we get them into the TEC and through our organisations into the union movement as well. Like, it's really important we see a movement of that, and that's one thing I'd like to see the TEC encourage and foster.
Yeah, I agree with Megan and then Luke as well. In terms of R&D review, for example, of the sector, and then we can start now. We don't have to wait for TEs to be established. And again, also the academy is encouraging the PhD skills, for example, should be covering just not only being academic research, but also have got other skills so that they are able to really make use of their abilities of critical thinking, analytical skills, and problem solving skills can be used. For example, they can go to industry, but the skills needed may be different. And again, if they are prepared for that one, they can go into government policy and again, science policy. And then again, academy really encourages the more people getting into science policy so that the science which is happening can be translated into policy, which can impact on the decisions taken by the government or the industry boards or otherwise courtrooms.
Kylie, I'll go back to you again. There is a number of questions coming through in relation to equity, and I don't want to pigeonhole you in just one basket, but there is a lot of attention on this. So forgive me for coming to you first on this, but what does the panel think about initial changes? What do universities have to do first to get more low socioeconomic students in the door, if you like? And secondly, are any equity groups missing from the accord?
So I think in terms from EFIA's perspective, I think things like remedying the JRG student contributions, but also then initiatives that directly impact and get money into the hands of students to address student poverty, such as placement grants, income support, the jobs broker with the part-time, aligning part-time work to their discipline study, as well as getting needs-based funding into the sector to support the implementation of the support for students policy would be probably the top 3 things that we would be saying that need to be addressed quickly to make immediate impact. In terms of the are there any equity groups missing from the accord? Look, in both of our submissions from EFIA, as both into the interim report and in the early discussion paper, we called out the need for a reimagination of the equity groups from Bradley. Over the last 15 years, our knowledge around student equity and the sophistication and the complexities around student equity, has really evolved. And there's been some amazing research done, particularly by colleagues up at the University of Queensland, that really look at the cumulative disadvantages of that come from belonging to multiple equity groups, but also acknowledging that equity is beyond those 4 equity groups. So, what's kind of not apparent in the report is things like we know people from caring who've been care experienced, their likelihood of going to higher education is much lower than those 4 equity groups. Same with students from refugee backgrounds, Pacifica groups as well. So, and I think probably one of the things that we found a little bit disappointing was the parity targets around disability as well. So, the data that universities collect around disability, occurs on enrolment. It's not the most accurate data that we're capturing. We're not capturing that engagement in actually the support services that students with disabilities are engaging with once they actually register for those support services. And we know that disability can occur across the student life cycle as well. So the data that we have as a sector around disability isn't reflective of the need. And I think we need to do a lot more work as a sector to understand that better, and then also to support parity of participation for students with disability as well.
so many challenges in so many areas, it seems. Terry MacDonald, I've got a question for you here. Be careful of what you wish for, I think is perhaps the theme of this question. Essentially, how do we cope with if the sector doubles in size as the Accord asks for? How do we cope? How do we stage it? How do we plan from a workforce point of view?
Yeah, so look, if you were to double the number of students, then you are going to have to expand the numbers of providers and the types of providers and what providers are focusing upon. We actually think that the study hubs, the current study hubs, are potentially going to be part of that bigger expansion, and that's going to be very interesting. So we are, that's an area that we're quite interested in. Particularly around the staffing of those hubs. It's primarily support staff as opposed to academic staff themselves. But there's quite a large number of them already, so it's quite interesting. Accord, but to the broader question, the Accord does make mention of looking at category provider standards and types, which we are going to be very much engaged in. And what it comes down to at the end of the day is ensuring that the workers in those providers are adequately paid, they're properly paid, that they have high quality, well-resourced jobs, and that they're able to meet the needs of the students and undertake research and anything else they want to do. I note that the Accord makes mention potentially of another group of 8 university, which would be group of 9. There might be some already that are vying for that GO9 position, but we won't go into that. So, it could potentially be a very different sector. And of course, vocational education is going to come in on this as well with TAFEs. So, we're quite interested in what the government might be looking at, noting, of course, that this is not going to happen tomorrow, that this is a longer term plan, and that, we're, going to certainly be involved in those discussions around that planning.
Tim, could I just jump in and ask a supplementary question, address it to Megan Lilly? How is, where are the resources going to come from? Are the TAFE systems going flexible enough, and indeed is the political will going to be there for them to step up, to fill some of these roles?
Well, yeah, so yeah, they can, yes, because the TAFE's got sort of quite a much more localised footprint. So, that sort of being able to utilise that, I think, is an important consideration, particularly around sort of some of the regional provision issues. But we do need to be mindful that TAFE, so when we talk about the intersection between TAFE and higher ed, we're not really talking about the vet sector becoming part of the university sector. It's about a more connected and coherent system rather than a takeover or just being subsumed. And I think that's a really important point to make. And it is also about valuing vocational education. So let's be sort of clear on some of those things. TAFE has a stronger regional footprint. Having said that, TAFEs are largely funded and run by state governments, and we're talking largely a Commonwealth government initiative here. So there is a lot to work through, and to just assume that will happen seamlessly goes back to the naivety point of one of the previous questions. Having said that, TAFE are actually quite responsive to local communities, so there's an enormous opportunity there. But in terms of, I'm just jumping ahead, sorry, Tim, to another question. I'm actually on a board of a community education centre in the country that has a country university centre as part of its suite of offerings. And I'm blown away by how amazing they can be. And that, there's sort of like quite a number of people in Mansfield, give Mansfield a plug, that actually are enrolled in tertiary education or get the support to. Sometimes the support is Wi-Fi or helping. I don't know how to footnote for this essay, so it's not the academic specialist type stuff. And I say with great enthusiasm that there's probably 30 people in that town, often mums with school-age kids, doing tertiary education, often a university degree that would not be doing it otherwise. So it isn't just the TAFE footprint. There's a whole other footprint out there that needs to be activated into all of this.
And can I just say as well, I'm a big fan of the country university hub model, And it's a great community asset, and seeing people get that, that kind of teaching support, learning support, just even peer support, just hanging out. It's the little missing piece that we've seen in more smaller communities that they need, and it's really exciting. And the other thing is, I think the rollout of more of these type of smaller hubs is a way to activate community assets. So years ago that, in some areas, TAFEs are often just somewhere where young people will go. It's kind of an opportunity to think about getting a job or skills or something they need. I think these hubs will also play a similar role, and they'll also activate TAFEs, and there'll be collaboration there as well. So, these are the kind of practical and small but really transformative steps we can take in the tertiary piece, I think, where you've got people learning in potentially online from a higher education or university provider, but they might be at a TAFE hosted hub, right? And the thing as well that's in the Accord report that's also a key element of this is the career support. And I've always thought that if students are taking some type of post-secondary education, they need someone to help them navigate it. We've got some really good thinking in the Accord around how we help them, not just with kind of job brokerage and getting work experience that's relevant to what they're studying. That's excellent as well. But I've always thought if a student's in a degree and actually they'd be better off doing an apprenticeship, who's going to help them through that journey, right? And that's a really important, that thinking is in the Accord report, and things like hubs, TAFE centres of excellence, lots of good thinking here that will, again, can get off the ground pretty quickly. Doesn't need the TEC to do it. So I think there's, lots and lots of opportunity for us to do some really good things for people that traditionally wouldn't have been able to access any form of post-secondary ed.
Which raises the really big question, I think, is that this is a task for the generations, the Accord as a whole. It's going to take a long while to do, and it's going to take bipartisan support. It's going to have to be accepted as a national task, a national objective right across the board. No point in starting all this stuff if there's an election on the other side, they don't like it anymore. How is there still a major job selling explaining what this is all about? Is there a major job still to do?
Well, I'll jump in on that again, because one of the things I said initially when I read the Accord was that this is putting tertiary education at the centre of the economic issue and solutions for the country, right? It's an economic statement as much as it is an education statement. And that's really about how to continue advocating for our sector. And then I think that lifts it into a bipartisan frame quite well, hopefully, right? I didn't want to say easily, but to unlock what we need for Australia's future, we've got to unlock the skills and talents and capabilities of our people. And that's why this is an economic vision for the country as much as it is the vision for education. One of the criticisms I've had of reforms in the past is it's always about the education side, not the job creation side or the individual side. And there's a lot of good thinking in this Accord around how important our sector is to the country, but the students' individual needs are for the success of the country. And I think that's how we rise it into bipartisan thinking. I did remind some Vice-Chancellors over the last couple of weeks that the demand-driven system in the response to the Bradley Review had bipartisan support.
It did.
So it's not impossible. And, we're having good engagements at Universities Australia with the Shadow Minister, and we'll continue to do that because we're in an election year and that's the right thing to do. But I am hopeful we'll get some level of bipartisan support for at least the really core principles that are outlined in the report.
Megan, Lilly, is that feasible?
Well, I've got to believe it's feasible because we need it to happen. And I think it's too important to let it sort of get caught in the weeds of political arguments that aren't always helpful. I think we and everyone else needs to continue to make the case for it from a nation building perspective, and sort of economic and personal social prosperity argument, and keep prosecuting that and hold people's feet to that argument.
Professor Jagadish, is there room for optimism and for your members?
Yes, Stephen, I think as been pointed out, that there is a need for a bipartisan support. Both sides see this as building our nation, setting our nation for the 21st century, and to be able to create a good quality of life and a good quality jobs for the next generation, and also make use of their abilities to the fullest extent for good of our country. It is absolutely critical, and I think let us hope that both sides of politics and all sides of politics come together and then see this as future of our country, and then implement the recommendations made by their call.
Tim, there's a bunch of good questions there. Have you anything you want to point to, Tim?
There's a couple of themes that have come through, additional themes that have come through. One is about AI. Accord makes reference to AI and the need to harness its power for teaching and productivity. Less is said on the strategies to support capacity development to prepare the academic and professional workforce. What's your solutions, panel?
Easily fixed.
So AI has got an important role to play. In fact, a week back, I attended the Supercomputing Asia conference in Sydney, and where people have been pointing out the important role AI is going to play in our daily lives, in all aspects of our lives. So that means we need to have, for example, we need to have the science of AI and AI for science, for example, just to give the research example of the research and science, both need to be done. That means we need to have a lot of investments in the high performance computing, and then again, trained people. In fact, whenever I talk to people in the computer science departments, they say that we cannot find academics we can recruit in order to be able to train the people needed to be able to make use of the AI and its capabilities in all aspects of our society.
I was just going to make a joke that I was going to put the question into ChatGPT and give you an answer, but I think one thing that we've talked about, and there's a really terrific House of Representatives inquiry into the use of AI in the Australian economy and the education focus on that. And one of the things my great friend Liz Johnson from Deakin said to me is, if you take an undergraduate who's going into an area that they're yet to master, they have to be taught how to use AI and how to critique it, right? Because AI is not always right, And I reflected on my time going to university in the late 1990s, where having the internet or use of internet resources was a novelty, right? And now it's kind of key practice. So I guess an observation is giving ample time and funding and resourcing to allow teaching and learning staff and innovators to experiment and get used to this technology. There was a fantastic piece of work that Gilly Salmon set up when she was at Swinburne and I was working there, and it was called the Digital Aquarium. And it allowed teaching staff to go in and play around with their current curriculum and adopt it to modern technology. And it was, sponsored by terrific, companies like, Adobe and others, right? And so I think that kind of work will be important as well, because young people are, they've been born basically with laptops and smartphones in their hand nowadays, but it's ensuring that our staff have the space to be able to adapt to emerging technologies. And then finally, just, ensuring that we, have proper regulations around AI, and that AI is seen as a tool, but not, not everything. And, reflecting on what we've seen with older Australians getting misinformation, particularly during election campaigns and things, those. So there's a kind of whole of society element to this as well. But I think if we pretend it's not happening and all go back to chalk and talk and 3-hour exams, I think that would be a missed opportunity, right? We have to ensure that technology is, we're adaptive to it, but it's a benefit, and that we, don't ignore it.
Just very quickly on that, if I can just add, I don't think chalk and talk is happening anymore for a majority of our members. I can tell you now that we are very much aware of the impact of AI in the workplace, in universities, and in TAFEs and other vocational education providers. It's in a higher education providers. It's something that we've actually had a lot of engagement with university staff and our membership around, and we've actually got a working group looking at it at the moment for those reasons which have been outlined, that it is now going to be a very, very important tool that will be needed for teaching and learning, but there also needs to be the capacity for training, for staff support. The infrastructure needs to be in place. It just can't be a case of, we're going to modernise, we're going to introduce AI to the curricula, off you go. So it's one of those things that staff are very much aware of and are asking questions about, and university managements do need to be engaged on.
Professor Jagadish, I've just got one question I wanted to throw in before I pass back to Stephen. The Accord talks about doubling student numbers. It does not talk about doubling research revenue or outputs. Are you concerned about that?
So thanks, Tim. And I think that's why the Academy is seeking a comprehensive review of the research and science sector and develop a plan for the R&D investment for the nation for the next decade or so that we can really reach to the, in the next decade or so, we'll reach the OECD average of 2.7% and try to maintain that one and then try to go towards 3%. So thereby, that allows us to be able to invest in research and research infrastructure, and in terms of also young people, because create a sense of hope for the younger generation. There are a lot of young people, they're after one contract after other, there's no certainty for them in terms of longer-term positions or so. So that's why we need to really invest in the longer term and make use of their abilities so that they can productively be able to contribute to the economy and also to the society and the broadly also industry as well. Because again, we would like to move towards advanced manufacturing in this country. And then that means we need to have skilled people. So that's why, how do you make sure that we're able to really create those skilled people? R&D investment is absolutely critical for the future of our country.
And just one quick comment. I'd like to see how, yes, we absolutely want to see the government roll out their commitment to 3% of GDP of R&D. But and I think Group of Eight's doing some road mapping on that, and they're talking to the sector about it, and we'll see how that can flow on. But one thing I think is really important when we're going to uplift R&D effort, we're going to have to uplift the number of students taking research and high degree programs. And I want to see more equity in that cohort as well, because we won't be truly successful as a nation if we don't have more equity in that cohort, because it, and a growing cohort as well. So, and then of course, giving, to Terry's point, that we have a system, a funding and regulatory system that supports research workforce, and that's going to be fundamentally important. So, but it starts from, there's a good start in this report, and let's take that win and move forward, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Luke. And it's very important to be able to train people, and again make use of the people in diverse communities. And whether we still have got a major challenge in terms of women not taking science in the schools, for example. That's a challenge. We need to start from the primary school level and make sure that all groups are continuing to stay in science, because STEM is going to play an important role for the future of our society. So that means we need to make, and the pipeline is continued to the tertiary level and to the PhD level.
If I can just,
sorry, go on.
So if I can quickly add to that, it's not just a matter of attracting people into the research training scheme, structures, but keeping them there once they're qualified, particularly women. We see a lot of women leave research, particularly in higher education, because of the nature of the employment with rolling contracts. It's very difficult to frame your life around that when you don't know if your work is going to be continuing. We welcome the Accord's recommendations to extend the duration of funding for projects, and we also welcome the idea of full funding for research, although that's going to have to be essentially one of those things that we're going to have to work at down the track. But it's something we've been calling for a long time, and we do believe it is possible. So just wanted to say it's not just a matter of getting people in, but keeping them there and keeping that, that talent in this country, so we don't lose it to elsewhere.
Tim, we're on time, and I know participants have got to go, but there's one question I'd like to close with, just throw it open to the panel in general. If you were writing a brief for the first TEC Tertiary Education Commissioner, what are the big issues that must come first? Throw that open to anyone.
I was going to say AQF. How are we going? Right? Question mark. Sorry, I knew you were going to say it, Megan. So
well, I've already said my big.
I know you've been saying it for so long.
Yeah. If you don't get the primary positioning right, you compound the problem.
Right. Terri MacDonald?
We'd probably go straight to funding. That's our thing, funding and regulation, but particularly funding. There's a lot of problems with the funding structures at the moment, whether you're looking at the JRG situation right through to, not funding the full, all the students who go through universities, if you're over your target, over your caps. So there's a whole range of things that we would like to see addressed within funding. And that, of course, then relates to workload, to the workforce, and the fund, university staff are essentially the largest expenditure of universities, because that's essentially the resourcing that you use for teaching and research. So, funding goes directly to working conditions.
The long first paragraph. Professor Jagadish, what would you say to the Commissioner?
Create an environment where the education and research sector flourishes and make use of the people, those who have been trained for contributing to our society through industry, through government, and through broad range of public good activities as well.
Dr. Austin, what about for students?
We would be advocating for student voice, but not just any student voice, students with lived experience to be represented in those reference groups up to the Australian Tertiary Commission, because we think we need to kind of start as how we mean to continue, and we need to design policy that is actually going to make a meaningful impact for these students. And so we really need to have their voice and the voice of practitioners in helping to shape what that looks like.
Government could do worse than making you lot all the first commissioners, but never mind. I think we're going to have to close. We're over time. Kylie Austin, Chennupati Jagadish, Megan Lilly, Terri MacDonald, Luke Sheehy, thank you so much for sparing the time after what has been an enormous week for all of you. I know how busy you are, and I'm very grateful. Thank you to Tim Winkler and Amanda Johnson as well. And we're out.